Okay, so welcome then to this talk, this VAM talk on the Passion of Jesus in art, the death of Christ in art, which is the third in a sequence. First one was on Christian art in general, about 2 years ago. Then in December 2018, I gave a talk on the birth of Christ in art, and now looking at the death of Christ in art. And there's a handout to go with this that I sent out to those who were registered up to about 12:30. So I'm now going to switch over to a slide set. Okay, so here we go. Looking at Christ's Passion in art. And, so we have just finished Holy Week. And Holy Week has a number of significant days in it, starting with Palm Sunday, when Jesus, remember Jesus entered into Jerusalem. Then Maundy Thursday, which is when he had the Last Supper with his disciples and washed their feet. Good Friday, the day of his crucifixion. Holy Saturday, when he was dead, lying in the tomb. Easter Sunday, which we celebrate his resurrection. And then that's followed 40 days later by Ascension Day, which is always on a Thursday. And then Pentecost, which is 50 days after Easter, counting inclusively, and the gift of the Spirit, the descent of the Spirit, and the birth of the church. So these events all go together as a set. They're bound together. And the Passion spans Thursday night and Friday, and is made up of a number of events, beginning with the agony in the garden. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying, wrestling with his Father in prayer, and submitting his will to the Father's will. That's followed by the betrayal and arrest, betrayal by one of his disciples, Judas. Then trials before various Jewish and Roman officials. In the case of the Jewish officials, it's before Annas and then Caiaphas, then before Pilate, and then the Jewish king Herod. Then Jesus is sentenced. Then he makes his way to the cross, is crucified, and then the burial and the entombment. And this has all provided a lot of material for art over the years for representation of the events of this sequence. And the artwork, initially, these events were depicted in sequence in what we can call an iconographic program, a sequence of the events of the Passion. And one of the earliest that we have is in Ravenna in Italy, in a church that was built in 504. It was built by Theodoric the Great. He was an Arian emperor. One of those who had so he built this basilica to be his cathedral, and decorated the inside of it with mosaic. And that included iconographic programs about the life of Christ. And I had the good fortune to go and look at this church back in 1984. At that point, I knew really nothing about Christian art, so I didn't fully understand what it was that I was looking at. And I look forward to going back some other time and with much greater appreciation for what this is about. On the upper level there, in the very top, there is a series of mosaics representing the final events in Jesus' life. 13 mosaics spanning the period from the Last Supper through the Passion, through the resurrection, and 2 post-resurrection appearances. So these were designed to be looked at by the worshipers who gathered in this space, and it told them the Bible stories. And there would be a corresponding on the other side, a set of mosaics giving the infancy of Jesus, his birth, the events associated with his birth. It's fairly remarkable to have mosaics from before the 8th century. Much of the Byzantine mosaics in the Eastern Roman Empire were destroyed during the iconoclastic period. And this is one of the great treasures that we have, to have these mosaics here. This collection of buildings in Ravenna is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a marvelous place to visit. Second set of iconographic program I want to talk about is in Monreale Cathedral in Palermo, Sicily. And this was built by the Normans in the late 12th, early 13th century, after the Crusades were over, and they set up a Norman kingdom on the island of Sicily and built a great cathedral and employed Byzantine mosaic craftsmen to do the decoration, to do the iconographic program. And so we have a series of 12 mosaics covering the span from the Last Supper all the way through to Pentecost. So here are 3 of them. On the left, the washing of feet. In the middle, the Last Supper itself, and then the arrest of Jesus on the right. But it's a sequence that spans 12 mosaics. I had the good fortune to be able to go and see Monreale Cathedral in 2012, and the mosaics are spectacular. And this work, this mosaic work in Sicily was important for helping be a conduit for Byzantine art to spread into the rest of Italy and have an influence upon Italian art, which then would have an influence eventually on art north of the Alps. The next one to talk about, so here's more of the sequence, sorry, to do with his crucifixion, deposition, taking down from the cross, and then his entombment, burial in the sepulchre. And finally, 2 post-resurrection appearances in mosaic. So on the left, a scene that's called Noli Me Tangere, which is Jesus and Mary Magdalene. At the end of John's Gospel, she's in the garden outside the tomb, and she mistakes Jesus for a gardener. And he says to her, "Don't touch me." And we'll cover that in more detail. And then on the right, doubting Thomas, or as this motif is known, the incredulity of Thomas. So that's part of this sequence in Monreale Cathedral. The third sequence to talk about is from the early 14th century. And now we're in Siena. And this is Duccio and an altarpiece that he made for the high altar in Siena Cathedral, in the Duomo. And this was a major event. It took 4 years, 1308 to 1311, 3 years to make. And then when it was complete, it was paraded through town to the Duomo, to the cathedral, with tremendous celebration and installed on the high altar. This is massive. It's about 5 meters tall, 16 feet tall, The central panel there on the left is 13 feet wide, and I think it's 9 feet high. On the left is the front, and this is what would be facing the worshipers. And by far the most dominant thing there is the Madonna and Child at the center. And this piece is called the Maesta, which means the majesty, because Mary is enthroned in majesty as Queen of Heaven. At the bottom, at the foot of it, is a series of paintings of the Nativity cycle, the infancy of Jesus. So this is what the faithful would see as they would come into the church and participate in worship. And Mary is front and center as an object of devotion. On the right is the back, and this is what the clergy would have seen, and they would have been able to get close to this and basically read the stories of Jesus, and it would help instruct them. And so this was, as it were, for educational purposes. At the top, well, I should say across the bottom, we have a series of miracles of Jesus, but also including the temptation and his calling of disciples. So third one over from the bottom left, you would see calling 2 disciples from their fishing boat. In the middle, the main central panel is a sequence of the final week of Jesus's life, covering the spanning from the first panel, which is entrance into Jerusalem, all the way through to Jesus appearing to disciples on the Emmaus Road. And then at the top is a series of post-resurrection appearances. This was a very important piece of art when it was done. It had a profound effect upon European art in the Renaissance. So the central panel is designed to be read in sequence. A diagram there on the left-hand side shows how it's to be read from the bottom left, and then moving right across the bottom row, and then left to right across the top row, moving from top to bottom, bottom back up to top, and so on. Now, this is the entire sequence, and many of you may recognize this because it's what I used for the Good Friday service. And I've been using these illustrations for 20 years, if not longer. It is the most comprehensive Passion cycle that has survived. And it is now in a secure, climate-controlled case, glass case, in the museum right next door to the cathedral. It is no longer on the high altar. Sadly, in the 18th century, this was cut up. Tragic that that happened. A few of the panels were lost, and a few of them are in museums in various other places in the world. So, for example, the Annunciation is in the National Gallery in London. The Calling of the Disciples is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and a few other panels are scattered. But the Passion cycle is complete. And working our way along the bottom here, we've got the bottom left, the calling of the entry into Jerusalem, then Jesus having the Last Supper with his disciples and washing their feet. Then in the center of the bottom row, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane praying. Then he's betrayed and arrested. Then we get various trials, bottom right and top left, before Annas, before Caiaphas, before Pilate, and before Herod. Then the crucifixion, then the entombment, and the descent from the cross, resurrection, and a couple of other scenes that we'll talk through. Okay, so that's the third narrative cycle of the Passion. The fourth cycle was done just 10 years or less than 10 years before Duccio did the Maesta, and this is by Giotto. And he did a series of frescoes in a chapel, the Arena Chapel. And he completely decorated all the walls of this chapel. It was a private chapel for Enrico Scriveni, who was a wealthy banker in Florence. He had built a big mansion, built a private chapel next to it, and employed Giotto to decorate it with this sequence of the Passion narratives. Or, well, there's also the infancy narratives, but we've got 26 frescoes, 26 scenes from the life of Jesus, of which 13 cover the period from the raising of Lazarus through to the scene of Mary, of Jesus with Mary Magdalene in the garden, Noli me tangere. Here's a few of the scenes: entry into Jerusalem, the expulsion of the money changers, Judas being paid in the middle. We've got the Last Supper and the washing of feet. And then here's some more: the arrest, Jesus before Caiaphas, the mocking of Jesus, the road to Calvary, the crucifixion, and lamentation over the dead body of Christ. Now, one of the things that's significant about items 3 and 4, Duccio's Maesta and Giotto's frescoes in the Scriveni Chapel, is that we know who the artists were. And they have become famous people. They are well known, Duccio and Giotto in particular, very well known. Prior to that, the mosaics in Ravenna and the mosaics in Monreale, in Palermo, were made by craftsmen. We don't know who those craftsmen were. They were tremendously skilled. They're great works of art. But here in the early 14th century, we begin to get the transition from a craftsman to an artist. Now, they're both, the artists are doing craft. They are craftsmen. So especially for a fresco, well, you've got to know how to use your tools, whether it's a fresco or painting on board and later on canvas. They were master craftsmen, but we tend to think of Duccio and Giotto and those who come later as being artists. And especially with the Scriveni Chapel, with Duccio's Maesta, this was a piece of art that was done for the whole congregation. So it was put on the altar in the cathedral. Everybody would see it. It was part of the worship space. With Giotto, he was doing the iconographic program of a private chapel for a private individual. And before too long, this would lead to, for a very wealthy banker. Now, the wealthy banker, Enrico Scriveni, he was trying to make penance for the unscrupulous behavior of his father, who had become fabulously wealthy. But it wouldn't be, it's not a big step from there to a patron employing an artist to make an individual painting for him that he could hang in his house, in his home. And those of you who were at my first talk that I gave on religious art, this is one of the things I talked about in that. The transition from craftsman to artist, and the transition that somewhat accompanied it from art being an integral part of the worship space to art being something that wealthy patrons paid for and hung on their wall and could get significant prestige for, having a beautiful piece of work hanging in their private space. When you have that, you would have an artist commissioning, would be commissioned to do a single painting. So it might be a painting of, well, the arrest of Jesus or of the Last Supper. It wouldn't be part of a narrative sequence like we've seen in these examples of the two mosaic sequences and of Duccio and of Giotto. The fifth sequence I want to talk briefly about is Fra Angelico. Sorry, that's not connected to this particular slide that I've got up right now. Fra Angelico, in the early 15th century, so 100 years after Giotto and Duccio. He was a Dominican monk, and he painted a set of frescoes for a convent in Florence, San Marco convent. There are 40 cells, in each of which individual room for an individual person. On each one, he painted a fresco for the inhabitant of that room for their personal devotion. And these are all of Christ. Some of them are, a few of them are of the Nativity. Most of them are of the cross, Christ on the cross, and a few are from other scenes of the Passion of Christ. And I'll be referring to some of those as we go along. And had the good fortune in 2004, Sue and I went and saw San Marco. They were all still in place. The convent's been turned into a museum, and it was very moving to see these works of art that now would be viewed as really exquisite artworks, but were still in place as devotional aids. And then we also got to see the Maesta in Siena. Okay, so that's 5 examples of places where we have a narrative sequence. And so you can trace the story of Jesus through this final week. And I think that's much the most interesting way. That's the way that this was originally designed as to how you would encounter all these artworks. Nowadays, much of it we see hanging on museum walls or on computer screens. Okay, let's launch into then the narrative sequence. So as a bit of a run-up, we've seen that these narrative sequences often begin with an entrance into Jerusalem. So here we have Duccio's Maesta, how he portrays the entrance into Jerusalem. The whole panel on the left, and then a detail on the right. You see Jesus riding in on a donkey, and to the acclaim of the crowds who are shouting out, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." In the detail, you can see a couple of people climbing trees to get a closer look. And this is also usually taken as a nod to Zacchaeus, who climbed up into a tree so he could see Jesus. That eventually, the event actually happened in Jericho rather than in Jerusalem, but it was just a few days prior to this event here. Also, at the bottom of the detail panel, you see a sort of a straggly, twiggy, treeless, leafless bush. That is the fig tree that Jesus cursed, that we read about in the Synoptic Gospels. So a little nod to that acted parable. Here's Giotto's rendition of the entrance into Jerusalem. Again, a couple of people climbing up trees, the crowd laying down their cloaks, their garments for Jesus. And on the right, the expulsion of the money changers. So the 3 Synoptic Gospels all agree that Jesus present Jesus as making a deliberate journey to Jerusalem, and his destination there wasn't just Jerusalem in general, but specifically the temple. And he drove out the money changers and the merchants and exclaimed, "This house should be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it into a den of rebels, of revolutionaries who are rebelling against God." And that was an implicit warning of judgment about to come upon the temple. Okay, moving much closer now to the Passion. The Passion itself begins with the agony in the garden, but all sequences of the Passion tend to begin with the Last Supper, which immediately precedes it and is a major artistic motif. So on the left is from San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, that church from 504. And this is the earliest representation that we have of the Last Supper. The supper isn't lamb, so we've got fish on the plate there. And you see most of the disciples are looking over at Judas, who is over on the far right-hand side. Then the next scene over, on the right, we have a manuscript illustration from the late 6th century in a set of illuminated manuscript of the 4 Gospels. And this was made in North Italy, and it accompanied St. Augustine. This isn't Augustine of Hippo, this is Augustine of Canterbury, whom Pope Gregory sent in the year 597 to England to re-evangelize the British people. They had been evangelized under the Romans. The Romans had left, and this was the sort of re-establishing Roman Christianity in England. And this Augustine would then be the first Archbishop of Canterbury. So in this manuscript that's in the Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, the library, we had the first representation of a chalice at the Lord's Supper. So you've got the loaves of bread there and the goblet in which the wine would be served. So it's our first representation of that, the chalice. This is from Monreale in Palermo. And we've got a couple of advances here in the iconographic representation of the Last Supper. The most noticeable is that one of the 12 disciples is sneaking along at the bottom, and this is Judas. Jesus is reaching out to him with a loaf of bread. And so this is the moment at which Jesus identifies who it is will betray him. It's the one whose hand is on the table with mine, and who is about to dip his morsel of bread into the mixture. So now we have the singling out of Judas. And this had already started. There's an illuminated manuscript from from around about the year 1000 that also does a similar thing with Judas, singles him out. And this will become a dominant motif in all subsequent depictions of the Last Supper. And then the second notable thing is that one of the disciples is reclining against Jesus. And this is John. He is young, he is beardless. Most of the other disciples have beards. And this is the beloved disciple who reclined against the breast of Jesus, we read about in John's Gospel. So 2 significant advances there in how this is depicted. The arrangement of the disciples around a semicircular table like that is typically Byzantine, and is still reflected in the Byzantine icon of the Last Supper, which I'll describe in a little bit. Moving on a bit further into the early 14th century to Duccio and Giotto. So Duccio on the left, Jesus is reaching out across the table to him with a piece of bread to offer that to the one who will betray me. Judas will take it and dip that piece of bread in the bowl. And then we also have John reclining on Jesus. And again, John is beardless. Most of the others wear beards and are a good bit older. Over on the right, Giotto's from the Scrivani Chapel. Again, we've got John reclining on Jesus, young, And then on the bottom left is Judas with his hand raised, sort of dipping the bread. So a close-up of Duccio, where you get to see both John reclining on Jesus, or on, well, sometimes he's reclining on the table, sometimes on Jesus. There, it's actually a bit hard to tell. It's almost both. And then Jesus reaching out the morsel of bread to Judas. Both Duccio and Giotto include the washing of feet, have a panel for that, which is part of the supper and is part of Maundy Thursday celebrations even today. And in both cases, and this is standard, it's Peter's feet that Jesus is washing. And this is because in John's gospel, Peter says to protests, "Lord, do you wash my feet? Why are you washing my feet?" And then he ends up saying, "Well, you shall never wash my feet." And then Jesus says, "If I don't wash your feet, you won't be clean." Then he says, "Well, wash every part of me." And Jesus says, "You don't need that." So among the not so great moments of Peter, his lack of understanding. Now the icon on the left, well, the Duccio's representation, the sandals are really quite distinctive. These black, almost look like ants or cockroaches or something. That's very distinctively Byzantine. And quite a bit of Duccio's art, you can see the Byzantine heritage from it. In this early 14th century, it's not long previous to this, the Byzantine art has made its way over to Italy. Whereas Giotto departs considerably and is much more creative in his own right. Okay, moving on now to the mid-15th century, so another 100 years later. This is also in Florence. And now Judas has been moved to the other side of the table, and he really is dipping his bread into the bowl. And all the disciples have halos, including Judas, but the halo of Judas is black. So he's been singled out much more as being on the out, both physically and multiple different ways. Peter is distinctive by wearing a different color robe. It's brighter than everybody else. And John, again, as a young man, reclining on Jesus. So close-up of the head of John, Judas with his black halo reaching into the his morsel into the bowl. For Angelico, also about the same time, middle of the 15th century, he takes the representation of the Last Supper a little further. And for him now, the way he's done this in cell 45 of San Marco, this meal is transitioning from the Last Supper to the Lord's Supper. So we have 8 of the disciples at the table. On the right-hand side, we have 4 disciples kneeling. One of them is Judas, as distinguished by his black halo. And then on the bottom left, Mary Magdalene is there, the penitent Mary Magdalene, also in order to participate in the meal. And basically, this is now an invitation for all those looking at this to also come to the table and participate in the Eucharist. Jesus has a paten on which sits the bread and a large goblet. So we've now got the implements, the utensils, the containers of the Eucharist. And of course, the most famous depiction of the Last Supper of all, Da Vinci's in Milan. And this was painted on the wall of a refectory, of a dining hall, of a convent. And very exquisitely painted. Unfortunately, it was on a very poor surface. And within 20 years, it really started deteriorating. And it's been a problem ever since. It's been restored many times. Major restoration was done, finishing just a few years ago, just a couple of years ago. And much of that work was removing the damage done by previous restorations. Now, in the previous depictions of the Last Supper, the moment that is caught is when Jesus is extending the bread to Judas, or Judas is actually dipping the bread into the bowl, indicating that he is the one who will betray. This is just shortly before that, the moment that Da Vinci has chosen to portray. He has said, Jesus has said, one of you will betray me. And the disciples are now all looking at each other and looking around to see, who is it? It's not I, Lord, not I. Da Vinci has arranged them in groups of 3, 4 groups of 3. And I've shown there at the top who the disciples are in which group. If we look and zoom in closer to the central 2 trios, on the left we have Judas, Peter, and John. Judas is leaning forward. Peter at the back has leaned over to John. John, again, is portrayed much younger than everybody else. Moments before this, he would have been reclining on Jesus. Now, Peter has his attention, and one can only imagine what Peter is saying to him. Notice in the extreme left, there is a dagger in Peter's hand. A little foreshadowing of the fact that when they are out in the garden, the moment of arrest, that he will slice off the ear of the servant of the high priest, a man called Malchus. 3 more disciples on the right, all gesticulating. The one at the back is Thomas. He's got his finger in the air, which is a foreshadowing of when he will stick that finger into the side of Jesus. Later on in John's Gospel, in one of the post-resurrection appearances. And coming much right up to date, Sadao Watanabe did 2 prints of the Last Supper, and we were pleased a few years ago to have them hanging on the walls of our auditorium when we hosted Watanabe's Japanese block prints for a month. In both cases, he's used traditional Japanese style, and has included, instead of lamb on the table, there's fish on the table, and there's sushi, and has contextualized it for a Japanese audience, and 2 very charming prints. And then finally, this is the last Lord's Supper picture I'll do. In the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, typically this event is called Harmistikos Deipnos, the mystical supper. And there is an established icon for this. This is a modern icon of the mystical supper. And you'll notice how similar the shape is to that much earlier depiction of the Last Supper from the Augustine Gospels from 1400 years ago. And this icon, you'll find it in inside every Orthodox church. It's usually positioned above the doors of the iconostasis. And through those doors, the high priest, the priest will go, the ministering priest will go into the holy space where the holy bread is kept and bring that out. So it's sacred space. So again, we're back to, for the Orthodox, they would see this icon as an integral part of the worship space. And it would include an implicit invitation for them to join Jesus and the disciples at the mystical supper. Okay, so that's all sort of introduction to the Passion. Moving on now, maybe I should just pause briefly. Any questions about the Last Supper? Or nope. Okay, the Passion then, just quickly review, that begins with the agony in the garden and ends with the burial of Jesus. And we have several major events, each of which have their established ways of being depicted in art. So the agony in the garden, followed by betrayal and arrest, the trials, sentence, the way to the cross, the crucifixion, descent from the cross, and then burial or entombment. Okay, agony in the garden. I'll start here with Duccio from the Maesta. So the full panel on the left, and notice that Jesus is in there a couple of times. The most of the disciples have fallen asleep. 3 of them are separate. That is Peter, James, and John, the 3 closest disciples. And they go part way with Jesus, and he then bids them watch and pray, while he goes off alone and prays. But sets him on the far right, praying to Jesus, praying to God, his Father. And you'll notice there's a hand extending from heaven, which is an angel ministering to Jesus as he wrestles in prayer. Agony, the Greek word agon, is a struggle. So he is wrestling in prayer to submit his will to the Father. Lord, let this cup be taken from me. He knows what it is, his path that lies ahead of him, and he knows how full of suffering it is. But he then submits his will to the Father and says, "Yet not my will, but thy will be done, Lord." Jesus comes back, finds the disciples asleep, and says, again, watch and pray, and goes and wrestles over again. This is Fra Angelico's depiction of the scene, and this is particularly interesting. On the left-hand side, we have the 3 sleeping disciples, Peter, James, and John, identified by their names written on their halos. In the background is Jesus praying, and he is being ministered to by an angel. And then on the right, Fra Angelico has chosen to depict Mary and Martha in their house. Now, in John's Gospel, this is just maybe a week earlier, the raising of Lazarus. And Mary is reading. So in the story of Mary and Martha, she was one who sat at Jesus's feet in the position of a disciple. So she is carrying on her studies by reading, and Martha is praying. And the 2 of them are alert and awake and devout at the same time that the male disciples, are slumbering and ignorant to all that is happening. It's a stunning juxtaposition there. Okay, next event is the betrayal and arrest. So Jesus is betrayed by a kiss from Judas there in the center. I love the way that Duccio has depicted this. The disciples are all fleeing, at the right-hand side. They all abandon Jesus and run away. At the left-hand side is Peter, in his usual impetuous self, jumping into the fray and slicing off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And we're told in John his name, Malchus. The disciples are terrified. Most of them are terrified and run away. Peter is hot-headed and hot-blooded and jumps into action, and Jesus in the middle is calm. It's a collection of Jewish priests and chief priests and elders and temple guard that has surrounded Jesus to arrest him. A couple of details there. Giotto's rendition of the same scene, fairly famous depiction of Judas at the moment of just about to kiss Jesus, and the temple guard and the others around, and on the far left, Peter slicing off the ear. Fra Angelico's depiction of the scene as well. Then Jesus is taken into the city, and there's a series of appearances before the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders. And this is quite clever, the way that Duccio has depicted this. At the top is Jesus in front of Annas, who had long been the high priest. He was no longer technically the high priest, but his son-in-law Caiaphas was. And Annas and his family had a lock on the high priesthood for many, many decades. I think it's 5 of his sons and one of his son-in-laws served as high priest after Annas did, which of course is not permitted under Jewish law, but the leading priests were, they weren't the first. This wasn't the first time that the office of high priesthood was corrupted, but they were profiting very well off of it and were in cahoots with the Romans. So upstairs is Jesus appearing before Annas, and downstairs is Peter warming himself by the fire, and the servant girl asking him, were you not with him? And she recognizes him, that he had been with Jesus, and he denies it. So it's his first denial. Then Jesus is taken before Caiaphas, and we have Giotto's depiction on the left, Duccio's on the right. In both cases, Caiaphas is, as the high priest, the sitting high priest, is tearing his garments. What he perceives is the charge of blasphemy over what Jesus is claiming for himself. Duccio, I think, is again masterful here because he has Peter standing outside in the open air, and these 2 Jewish officials are questioning him. And a servant girl questions him, and for the 3rd time he denies Jesus, and then the cock crows. So again, the next panel in Duccio's arrangement. Meanwhile, inside, Jesus is being mocked by the Jewish leaders. He's got a blindfold on, and mocking him while Caiaphas looks on. Jesus is then sent to Pilate, and we read that, and here in the way Duccio has represented this, and his clever use of space, even if he doesn't quite have perspective right, the full rules of perspective hadn't yet been worked out. But the Jews are standing outside, and we read that they stayed outside. They didn't want to defile themselves. It was the day of preparation, and they didn't want to go into the Roman palace, for that would defile them. And the dynamic presented in John's gospel is Pilate is repeatedly, he's inside questioning Jesus, And then he goes outside to talk to the Jewish leaders. Then he goes back inside to question Jesus, then back outside to talk to the Jewish leaders. And Duccio captures that very nicely. Jesus, again, is standing very calm. I should also make a comment about Jesus's robe. So he's got a blue robe, dark blue robe. This would be the most precious color. This time it was made from a crushed mineral, the mineral lapis lazuli, much of which is mined in Afghanistan. So it came a long way. It was a very expensive mineral, and it was used to depict heaven and God and sometimes Mary. So Jesus' divine is painted in that color with a gold trim to his robe. So all very expensive depiction. Later on, this color would be called ultramarine, ultramarine, because it comes from over the sea, from overseas. Okay, Jesus goes back inside and he questions Jesus while the Jews are staying outside. Then Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. Herod is, this would be Herod Antipas, who is the ruler of Judea, of Galilee and Perea. He doesn't have any authority. He's not a ruler in Judea, in Jerusalem, but he's in town for Passover, and Pilate takes advantage of that to send Jesus to Herod, who finds nothing wrong with him and sends him back to Pilate. And notice now that Jesus' robe has been stripped off of him, and Pilate questions him again. Then Jesus is beaten, a scene that we call the flagellation, usually depicted as he's bound to a column and scourged with a whip. Is crowned with thorns, and a reed is put in his hand. You see it in his right hand there, a thin reed representing a scepter, and he is mocked and acclaimed as King of the Jews, sort of a mock coronation with the crown of thorns. So the crown of thorns and the flagellation both become familiar motifs for artistic depictions. Giotto's version of the same scene, crowned with thorns, he's got a reed, scepter in his hand, being beaten and slapped by people. Fra Angelico depicted this, the mocking of Christ, mocking of Jesus. So a detail view of it on the right, where you have he's being spat upon. We've got a couple of hands there indicating he's being slapped with hands, rods with which he is being beaten. And this is a fairly well-known depiction. Hieronymus Bosch, who in the early 16th century did some very vivid, dynamic, quite grotesque faces in a number of paintings. And we have someone crowning Jesus with a crown of thorns, and he's got a armored fist there, crossbow stuck through his turban, and Jesus is surrounded by these quite hostile people. So then Pilate washes his hands, and we get ready for the sentencing. And Pilate brings Jesus outside and presents him to the Jews. And in John 19, we read, Pilate went out again and said, "See, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to him, "Behold the man." So John 19, verses 4 and 5. And that phrase, "behold the man," in Latin is ecce homo. So this has been described as the ecce homo scene. And this painting by Antonio Cesari, which is in Lugano, is the most famous depiction of it. Ecce homo, presentation of the man. And with that, Jesus is condemned to death and by crucifixion, and begins his journey to the cross. But before we take that journey with him, any questions about any of those scenes, the agony, the betrayal and arrest, the trials, the sentencing, all sort of a collection of motifs in art. Okay, the way of the cross. So Jesus makes a journey to the cross. This is just various terms he used for this. The way of the cross in Latin is via crucis, so it's often called that. Or the via sacra, the sacred way, the via dolorosa, the way of sorrows, and the way of, earliest depictions in, again, back to Ravenna. So the very early 6th century. It's a very simple scene. Simon of Cyrene is carrying the cross. That cross doesn't look robust enough to actually carry a man. And just a few accompaniments. And we've got Golgotha there in the background. So a fairly simple, straightforward depiction of it. Then now we've got Giotto and Duccio, their depictions. So we've got with Giotto in particular, a much more robust cross. In actuality, Jesus would not have carried the whole cross. He would have just carried the crossbeam. And around his neck would have been what in Latin is called the titulus, the charge against him. It's in 3 languages, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And the vertical post would have been in situ, and he would just carry the patibulum, the crossbeam. But all the artistic depictions are of him carrying the full cross. And after Duccio's cross still looks reasonably lightweight, not too difficult for Simon of Cyrene to carry there on the right. But Giotto's cross is a lot more substantial and much heavier to carry. In Giotto, at the far left, we've got Mary, identified by her halo. And then for Duccio, we have Mary, identified again by her halo and by her blue robe and its gold trim. Again, this very precious particular color of blue, lapis lazuli. And then some of the other women accompanying her. Now, over time, in the medieval period, the way of the cross developed into 14 stations of the cross that were identified. And this is mostly legendary, but begins with Jesus is condemned to death. The first 9 stations of the cross are on the way, they're on the road, they're on the Via Dolorosa or the Via Crucis. And today in Jerusalem, you can follow the Via Dolorosa. It is mapped out, and along the way, these 9 stations are indicated by plaques on the wall next to the street. The Via Dolorosa, from a point of view of geography, is completely wrong. for well, a couple of reasons. It assumes that where Jesus is condemned to death, which we know, we're told in the Gospels, is in the Praetorium, which is where the Roman governor would come and stay, and there'd be a Roman guard based there. And it was assumed that that was at the Antonia fortress, which is on the northwest side of the temple. We now know that that is not true, that Pilate, when he came to town, stayed in Herod's palace, which is over just south of what is today the Jaffa Gate, on the other side of town. And that was the Praetorium. Secondly, the area at the traditional beginning of the Via Dolorosa, where Jesus is condemned to death, John tells us it's a place called the Lithostratos, the stone pavement, or Gabbatha. And what is pointed out to you today is actually not from the 1st century, it's from the early 2nd century. And that pavement is part of the Forum, the Roman Forum, dating from the year 135, when Emperor Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman city. And the basic layout of Jerusalem, even today, of the main roads, is the same as it was imposed by Hadrian. So it's very, very old. It's just not quite old enough. It's 2nd century rather than 1st century. One of the first sites in the Via Dolorosa, after leaving the Lithostratos, is the Ecce Homo arch, that is said to be where Pilate brought Jesus out and presented him to the Jews. Ecce Homo, behold the man. That is actually also from Hadrian. That's his one of his typical triple arches that he built in lots of places. So the Stations of the Cross then continue. Jesus receives his cross. He falls for the first time under his cross. So he falls 3 times. We have no reference to that in the Gospels, other than he stumbled just before Simon of Cyrene took the cross. So that's station number 5. Number 6, Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. We have no mention of Veronica in the Gospels, but this would become extremely important over time from an art point of view. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Number 8, Jesus speaks to the women of Jerusalem. That is indeed in the Gospels, that's correct. By number 10, he has arrived at the site of the cross, the crucifixion, stripped of his clothes, nailed to the cross, dies, is taken down and placed in the tomb, all of which is nowadays inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is either at exactly the right or very, very close to the right place, which encompasses both Calvary, or Golgotha, and the tomb. Okay, so what is that station, station number 6, Veronica wipes the face of Jesus? Well, here's a painting of Veronica, and she is holding what looks like a napkin. She's kneeling down by the side of Jesus, and it's as if Jesus is in the act of passing her the napkin. So according to this, Jesus was sweating, and Veronica, Saint Veronica, as she later would be, handed him her napkin, or in Latin a sudarium, which just means a sweat cloth. And he wiped his face with it and handed her back the napkin, and his visage was left on the napkin. So it miraculously, a true image of Jesus's face was left on the napkin. And this became venerated as being the veil of Veronica, or simply called the Veronica. And it shows up in a lot of art. It was an item of great devotion. back in the medieval world. Now, Veronica, the very name Veronica, you can mix up the letters and get Vera Icon, which means the true image. So that's Veronica with her veil. And here are a couple of paintings from the 15th century of her holding up her veil with the true image on it, the Vera Icon. And this became an object of great veneration. Francisco Zurbarán did a clever painting where he painted sort of trompe d'oeil, the napkin, and the looking as if it is 3D, and the image on it. Then here, another famous picture of the way to the cross, Jesus carrying his cross. It's a pretty substantial cross. He's completely surrounded by these men who are looking pretty fearsome, sort of typical Hieronymus Bosch style faces. And they are completely crowding in around Jesus. And in the middle, Jesus is completely calm and serene. And down at the bottom left is Veronica with her napkin, with her veil. This was an object of a tremendous importance in the medieval era. The Pope pronounced an indulgence to anybody who would pray to the veil, in front of the veil of Veronica, the true image. And so arose a particular prayer that you would pray in front of this image, the prayer Salve Sancta Facies, Hail Holy Face, from the early 14th century. And by saying that, and so people would have in their home a painting of the veil of Veronica with the text of that prayer, and they would stand in front of it and pray. And by the Pope's decree, they would get so many years off of purgatory. That's the point of an indulgence. Now, there's a sense in which the Western Church was playing catch up to the Eastern Church, because the Eastern Church had already had an image of the true face, something that is called the Mandylion, that was located in Edessa, where, according to that legend, King Abgar of Edessa had gotten very ill, sent a messenger to Jesus, asking him to come and heal him, and Jesus couldn't go, but he sent along again a sweat cloth, a sudarium, or a mandylion in Greek, with his image wiped onto that cloth, and that became an object of great reverence in the eastern part of the church. So that's Veronica and her veil. But of course, we know what what the true image looks like. Here's the head of Christ. It became so popular and hangs in so many houses all over the world. 1940, Warner Solomon's head of Christ. Yeah. Okay, back to the Stations of the Cross. Now, a number of the stations are non-biblical. The second and third fallings, Veronica wiping the face, and so on. It has become quite common nowadays to put up the Stations of the Cross inside a church, go and around the church, to put up little plaques on the wall and invite people to follow the Via Dolorosa, the Via Crucis, the way of the cross, and to stop at each plaque and meditate on what is depicted there of the stations. Michael O'Brien, who is a Canadian, he's an author. He's written quite a number of books, several of which I've read, some very, very interesting books on, and he's an artist. And he sort of has reconfigured the Stations of the Cross to make 14 biblical stations, where you actually have, they follow what is in Scripture and did a painting, a small painting for each one. Here's the entire sequence of all 14 of them. They're published, he's published them in a couple of devotional books. And I came across them a couple of years ago in a devotional booklet on the Stations of the Cross. It was put out for Lent and for the Passion season. I just think these are wonderful. So let me just run them. I've put them on the handout, what they are. So starting in the top row at the left, Christ prays in the garden. Then Jesus is betrayed and arrested. Then he is condemned by the Sanhedrin, that's the Jewish council. Peter denies Jesus. Then Jesus is condemned by Pilate, who you see washing his hands. Jesus is scourged and crowned with thorns, and Jesus takes up his cross. So that's the top row. Next row, bottom left, Simon of Cyrene helps Jesus carry the cross. Then Jesus meets the weeping women. Then Jesus is crucified. Then he promises paradise to the crucified thief. So you see the two hands of the two malefactors, the two revolutionaries on either side. The one on the right holding out a fist, rejecting Jesus, mocking Jesus, and the one on the left holding out a hand of friendship and accepting Jesus' invitation to paradise, promise of paradise. Then Jesus cares for his mother, Jesus dies, and Jesus is buried. So a beautiful set of contemporary icons for the Stations of the Cross. And okay, at the end of the way of the cross is the cross itself, and the crucifixion is depicted many works of art. Of course, in the iconographic programs, it's just one of a sequence of a lot of artistic events. But then a lot of artists have done their own single paintings of the crucifixion. So here's Duccio's Maesta. Again, I particularly like this, and if you've been at Good Friday services, you will recognize this. So we have Jesus on the cross with the two malefactors on either side, the two revolutionaries, the two rebels on either side. And at the foot of the cross, just jumping a little bit ahead, on the top of page 4 of the handout, it's become a prominent motif. Who is at the foot of the cross? So here with Duccio, he has a lot of people at the foot of the cross. On the left-hand side are the women. A lot of women there. Mary is distinguished at the front with her dark blue robe trimmed in gold and halo. Holding her hands is John, to whom Jesus will say to them, to John, woman, behold your son, and to John he'll say, behold your mother. And he commends them to each other's care. Behind Mary, the mother of Jesus, the woman in red is Mary Magdalene. And one of the ways we can tell that is Mary Magdalene is that her hair is down. Her hair is visible. And that is a nod to her former sinful ways. So she's usually depicted either with uncovered hair or at least with hair that is visible. And normally the women are they're veiled, their hair is not seen. So we know that's Mary. At the back, there are a couple of men. So there'll be Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. At the right is the hostile crowd, Jewish leaders mocking Jesus. In its very simplest form, some of the early depictions of the crucifixion just have two people at the foot of the cross, and that's John and Mary. Sometimes some depictions have at the foot of the cross is Mary Magdalene holding onto the cross, basically the penitent sinner full of sorrow at the suffering and death of the Lord who has really saved her life. Sometimes at the foot of the cross is a Roman soldier, the centurion. While Jesus was on the cross, he thirsted, and he was offered a sponge filled with vinegar, soaked in vinegar, that was offered up on a reed. And then when he died, later in the day, he was speared in the side by the Roman centurion. And tradition came to view, and it's in Mark's gospel, the centurion who says, indeed identifies, truly this was the Son of God. And early church tradition gave this soldier a name, Longinus, and then canonized him as Saint Longinus. So he became an important figure in early church tradition. So sometimes he's depicted at the foot of the cross. Sometimes it's the three Marys are there. Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of St. James Less, mother of. But in Ducchio's case, we've got many more women than that. So a rich collection of people there at the foot of the cross. Ducchio's depiction of this, Mary in the deep blue, and Mary Magdalene with her hair unbound, caressing and weeping on the feet of Jesus at the foot of the cross. And you may just make out at the foot of the cross, there's a little rocky outcrop, and at the foot of that is a little hole, a little cave, and in that is a skull. Because in tradition, the place of the crucifixion was equated geographically in spiritual geography with the place where Adam died. So that's ultimately Adam's skull as the first human is there. And there's a couple of bones as well, you can just see. And this is a common motif in artistic depictions of the cross, is to have a skull at the base, indicating that literally, or at least from point of view of spiritual geography, theological geography, Jesus died in the place where the first Adam had died. Except that now it's going to be the death of the first Adam brought death, and the second Adam is bringing victory over death. And the tragedy of Adam is reversed by the death of Christ. Okay, Fra Angelico in San Marco, many of the cells received a painting of Jesus on the cross, the crucifixion scene. In this case, we've got Mary, the mother of Jesus, on the left, Saint Dominic on the right. Fra Angelico was a Dominican monk. And then Mary Magdalene with her hair uncovered and undone, weeping over Jesus at the foot of the cross. And she would then be hiding by her knee. She's hiding the skull that would be at the foot of the cross. Most of the depictions of the crucifixion in the various cells at San Marco, the skull is pretty prominent at the foot of the cross. Then a couple of rather different views of the cross. This is by Salvador Dali, painted in 1951, the Christ of St. John of the Cross, so called because he was inspired by a sketch made by St. John of the Cross in the mid-16th century, a view looking down on the cross, and Dali took that. This was acquired by the museum in Glasgow in Scotland for the vast amount of £8,000 back in the late 50s, I think it was, maybe the early 60s, which the critics thought was a completely unreasonable, unconscionable amount of money to spend for what they viewed as a very inferior piece of art and just bizarre. It has since become, now it's voted Scotland's favorite piece of art in all of its museums. And it has repaid that money probably 1,000-fold, because people flock to the museum in Glasgow to see this one piece. So it's, yeah, voted the best painting in Scotland. So a view looking down on the cross as if this is God looking down on Jesus. And then at the bottom is a scene from Spain, from the area in Spain where Dali is from. This is a famous crucifixion scene. This is from an altarpiece painted for Isenheim. The Isenheim altarpiece. This is the main central scene, the crucifixion central panel, early 16th century. It's a bit more involved. It's a very gruesome depiction of Jesus, very, very haggard, his hands like claws. Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, and note that she has her jar of ointment there. So that's making the equation to the Mary that anointed the feet of Jesus with her alabaster jar. And Mary Magdalene is often identified in paintings by having a jar of ointment. At the left is John, the beloved disciple, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, whom Jesus has entrusted to each other as mother and son. And then unusually at the right is John the Baptist pointing at Jesus and saying, "Behold the Lamb of God." You can just make out some writing there. It's "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," and pointing with the sense of he is heralding Jesus, pointing ahead to Jesus. And at his feet is the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, carrying a reed cross and bleeding into the communion chalice. So it's a bit unusual to have John the Baptist. Of course, he wasn't physically present at the cross, but theologically, this is very true. Jesus, John the Baptist pointing to Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, and that he's going to do that by dying on the cross. And then Graham Sutherland, and you can tell looking at this that he had obviously seen the Isenheim altarpiece. He painted this as a commission for an Anglican church in Northampton in the UK, just after the Second World War, 1946, coming out of the horrors of that war, and a very, yeah, quite gruesome depiction of the crucifixion. Another unusual scene, James Tissot did a large collection of paintings of Bible scenes, sort of almost as if they were photographic, I mean, trying to really capture what the scene might have looked like. And here's one looking down from the cross, what Jesus might have seen, looking at those below him. This whole sequence is in the Brooklyn Museum and available as a beautiful book. And then this is a famous painting by Francisco Zurbarán, The Bound Lamb. You could say it's simply a still life of a lamb bound by its legs, but very obviously this isn't just any lamb. This is a lamb lying, as it were, on the slab, waiting to be slain. So it's called The Bound Lamb, but then with the subtitle Agnus Dei, Lamb of God. And there are 6 known versions of this in various museums. This one is from the Prado in Madrid. Okay, so the deposition. 2 different names for this particular scene. It's sometimes called the descent from the cross or the deposition. This is an early example, and it is sort of early 14th century. It's relatively straightforward in terms of who the people are that are present. So this is taking down the body of Jesus from the cross. And we've got 2 older gentlemen who are bearded, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. So Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and requested the body, was given it to take down, and then John's Gospel also mentions that Nicodemus was with him. Joseph is the older gentleman. He is on top of the ladder. Early depictions of the cross are quite low down. Eventually, in art, over time, the cross got taller and taller, and so a ladder was needed to get up the cross and take people down. In actuality, the way that the Romans crucified people, the feet of the person would be just not very far above the ground. They were not high up on a cross like you see in, well, Duccio's cross of Jesus is very tall indeed. This one isn't that tall. But Joseph is lowering Jesus down. He's climbed up the ladder and is lowering, and Mary, again identified by her dark blue robe and gold trim to it, is caressing Jesus, her dead son, as he's lowered. John, the beloved disciple, beardless, is on the right, also helping lower him. And with Mary are the other 2 Marys. So we've got the 3 Marys, and it looks like there's 3 Marys. Again, with the red cloak is Mary Magdalene, her hair visible. And then at the bottom right is Nicodemus using pincers to remove the nails from Jesus' feet. So that collection of people is pretty standard for every depiction of the deposition. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Joseph of Arimathea up the cross, Nicodemus often removing the nails, John, and the 3 Marys. This is a well-known one by Rubens, so quite a bit later. And we've got Joseph of Arimathea up the ladder. They're using a shroud to lower Jesus down. We've got 4 women in the scene, and Nicodemus will be one of the ones in there as well. So lowering Jesus. And then Watanabe, when we had his art, and we've got a crucifixion, and then we have descent from the cross. And I used this image of the descent from the cross for the publicity for today's talk. I particularly like this because, and I've liked this ever since I first saw this particular scene, because it's clear that Watanabe understands the iconography of the deposition, of the descent from the cross. So he's got all the right elements there. You've got the ladder, you've got Joseph of Arimathea, top of the ladder, lowering Jesus into the arms of Nicodemus, I think would be the lower left character. We've got the 3 Marys there. And I think the only one lacking is John. But he's rendered this as a traditional style Japanese block print. So he's got the iconography exactly right, but he's contextualized it in a Japanese motif. I just think that's a wonderful joining together of the two, of maintaining the iconography, but recontextualizing it into a completely different cultural idiom. Very skillfully done. There are lots more deposition artwork out there. Lots and lots of paintings have been done of that. Now, at this point, Jesus has been removed from the cross. He's suffered, crucified, and is dead. And a lot of different instruments have been involved, what are called the instruments of the Passion, or in Latin, the Arma Christi, the arms of Christ. And these instruments show up in a lot of different art. This is the most complete set of instruments that I've seen. So on the left-hand side, in fact, it needs two panels to show all the different instruments. So on the left-hand side, we've got the cross. That's the most significant instrument. And then also there are the two crosses either side of Jesus. We have the ladder used for the descent. We've got on top of the right-hand crossbar of the ladder, we have the pincers used to take out the nails. Either side of that cross, on the left is the sponge on top of the reed that is offered up to Jesus when he's cried out, "I'm thirsty." On the right is the spear that the Roman soldier used to pierce his side, the soldier who later on would receive the name Longinus. We've got the hammer on the top of the left crosspiece of the cross that was used to pound in the nails. Moving over to the other, the right-hand set of pictures, we've got on the left-hand side, well, actually in the center, let's start with that, is the column or the pillar to which Jesus was tied when he was scourged or whipped. On the left-hand side at the top is the whip itself, or the scourge. There is the torch that was used to light the way to take him to the cross. On the right side of the column are the 30 coins paid to Judas for betraying Jesus. There is the ewer, or the jug, the pitcher that Pilate used to wash his hands, and next to it is the hand that he washed. And lower left, a lantern that lit his way, and the chalice from the Last Supper. So that's a very complete set of the Arma Christi, of the instruments of the Passion. Some of them show up in this picture, this painting. It's from the early 14th century, the Adoration of the Lamb, and this is the central painting in an altarpiece, the Ghent altarpiece, early 15th century, by the Van Eyck brothers, painted for the altar in what is now called St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent, Belgium. And this is massive. It's a very large painting. It was a very significant painting from a technical point of view. This was Van Eyck, really, the Van Eyck brothers pushing new ground with with their depiction of the scene. It's also a fantastic theological scene. The Adoration of the Lamb, surrounded by all this great company of people, the prophets and the martyrs and the saints and the women and the bishops and what have you. 2003, Sue and I went to Belgium and sat in front of this for 2 hours, meditated on it. before I then preached on Revelation chapter 5, the Lamb standing as though slain. So zooming in on the central image there, the Lamb standing as though slain on the altar, blood pouring from his breast into the communion chalice. And behind him are angels holding 4 of the instruments of the Passion. So we have the cross, and on the cross is the charge, the titulus, Jesus, which is often abbreviated as INRI. You may have seen that in a lot of paintings, short for Jesus Nazareorum Rex Judaeorum. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In Latin, it's the initials of the first 4 of the 4 words. So the cross, next to that is the lance that the Roman centurion used to pierce his side. And then to the right of the Lamb is the sponge on top of the reed. So it's almost as tall as the lance. And then the column, the pillar to which Jesus was tied when he was scourged. So that's what those 4 objects are doing in that painting. They're representing the instruments of the Passion. Okay, after Jesus is lowered, the next scene that's depicted is the lamentation. Beginning with the Pietà, which is usually, it's been very common for the Pietà to be shown in sculpture, 3D sculpture, most famously by far, Michelangelo's sculpture, marble sculpture in St. Peter's in the Vatican. Justifiably famous, just an astonishing piece of work, this. So Mary cradling her dead son. So this is after the deposition and before laying him in the tomb. The lamentation here is a fuller scene, Giotto's from the Scrivani Chapel. We have Mary looking into the face of Jesus. She's just behind him, identifiable because, well, she's face to face with Jesus and because of her blue robe. At Jesus's feet is Mary Magdalene, identified by her hair that is undone, cradling his feet. 5 other women around Jesus. 6 other, and then a whole bunch of women approaching from the left, bearing their ointments. John, beardless with his arms outstretched in horror. And then at the right, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. The body of Jesus will in due course be laid into Joseph's tomb. So the lamentation, and then this merges then into the preparation for burial, which is a scene that comes from out of the Byzantine world. The Byzantine, so Eastern Orthodox Christianity, one of their again, I'd probably say this is craft rather than art, but they have something called the epitaphios, which is the burial cloth, and taphe is the Greek word for tomb. So epitaphios, it's what they would be the shroud they wrapped it in order to put him in the tomb, but it becomes an elaborately embroidered cloth that is then brought out every year at the time of the Passion, and be the cloth in which Jesus is laid to prepare him for burial. So that epitaphios, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, if you go in the main door, one of the things that is straight ahead of you as you go in is a big stone slab on which supposedly Jesus was laid to prepare him for burial. Those of you who've been with me to Patmos and been into the museum there, the treasury, upstairs there were a few instances of the epitaphios, of this burial, either embroidered fabric on which Jesus was laid, or like which he was laid. In Western art, this then developed into, rather than having an epitaphios as such, it was having an entombment, Jesus being prepared for burial and then laid into the tomb. So that's what's happening here in Ducchio's representation. So we've got 4 women plus John, and then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus there, all at the cross, all at the tomb. A rather more gruesome scene. This is back to Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece. Underneath, as part of the stand for the altarpiece, is this depiction of Jesus, preparing him to put him into the tomb at the left, into the sepulcher. Jesus is covered in spots. This altarpiece was prepared for convent where they treated the sick, and that included treating lepers. And so it's as if Jesus is, as identification with that community, Jesus is being depicted as that way. Being cradled by John at his shoulders, and Mary Magdalene there. Then Hans Holbein, who we know had seen the Isenheim altarpiece. His father, Hans Holbein the Older, took him to see it. He then depicted Jesus in the tomb after he'd been laid in place and the lid put on. This is painted life-size. So the upper image is 6 feet long, and then a closer up view of it. A few years ago, I preached a sermon on Jesus on Holy Saturday, Jesus in the grave. And I used this image, put it on the cover of the worship guide, and received plenty of comments about it. Most people had never seen it, and certainly it's a very unusual scene. Don't usually have a painting of Jesus alone, dead in the grave. Now, the Isenheim altarpiece in particular makes you reflect back on the passion of Jesus. Passion means suffering. Passio is the Latin word for suffering. And all 4 of the Gospels can be viewed as an extended passion with, or as a passion with an extended introduction. The last 18 hours of Jesus's life, from the Last Supper and beginning with the agony in the garden through to his death, is covered in very great detail. The word passion is then used for Bach. He wrote a St. Matthew's Passion. He wrote a St. John's Passion. Other people have done settings of the St. John's Passion, which is essentially taking those texts, setting them to music, and following Jesus from the garden through the trials, the way to the cross, and then death on the cross. And this gave rise, looking back over this whole stretch, of the portrayal of Jesus as the man of sorrows. Taking the term from Isaiah 53, verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. So here is essentially an early icon, a 14th century icon from the National Gallery in London on the left. Jesus has his hands crossed so that his wounds in his hands, the nail marks are visible. His wound in the side is visible. Now we talk of the 5 wounds, 2 in his feet as well, 2 in his hands and 1 in the side, 5 wounds, 3 of them visible here. Jesus is usually shown head inclined downwards, and he's rather gaunt. And often, as here, he's standing inside the tomb, inside the sepulcher. So in the Western world, this is called the Man of Sorrows. In the Greek world, the Orthodox Church is called the akratapinosis. Tapinosis is the word for humiliation. It's used a few times in the New Testament. Akra is utmost or extreme. So this is the extreme humiliation of Christ. How far did he give up himself in becoming human and entering into human history? Well, akra, to the very extreme, to the utmost. And again, those of you who've been with me to Patmos or even gone to Patmos without me, in the treasury there at the monastery and up on the hill is a painting by El Greco of the akratapinosis. So a famous artist, and turned his attention to this motif as well. And in the Orthodox Church, it's treated as it is an icon, used as an icon. So here's a early Russian icon of the akratapinosis. Princeton University has a Sinai icon collection. It's a marvelous repository of early icons. These are both undated, which means they're old. And the one on the right, a bit more unusual in that Mary is cradling Jesus. But we see his handprints, and both cases, head inclined. This is an early Western example from an illuminated manuscript from the late 14th century, Welsh manuscript, a book of hours. So it's a book that would be used for devotional exercises by nobility. You'd have to be rich to afford one of these illuminated manuscripts, which would then guide you through praying the hours of the day. Now here, Jesus is standing in the tomb, and we have a number of the instruments of the Passion. So behind him is the cross with the title, the titulus, the charge, INRI, Jesus Nazareo Rex Judaeorum. Jesus Nazareanus, Rex Judaeorum. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The ladder, the lance or spear, and the sponge on the reed. We've got the pillar to which Jesus would have been tied for scourging, the 2 scourges or 2 whips. On top of the pillar is the cock that crowed when Peter denied Jesus. We've got some nails there, and Peter's sword, and the hammer on top of at the right-hand side. At the bottom are the dice that the soldiers used to throw dice to decide who they threw lots for who would get the seamless garment that Jesus wore, and that's the seamless garment that's draped over the side of the sepulcher. So plenty going on in that illustration there. Now, after Jesus was in the grave, what was he doing in the grave? Well, according to Hans Holbein the Younger, he was simply dead in the cave. But according to much theology over the last 2,000 years, Jesus went somewhere. He descended into hell. And some Protestants have trouble saying that line from the Apostles' Creed. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. And the third day he rose again. Part of the problem there is which hell. There are multiple hells. And I think originally it was just intended to say he descended into hell. Hell is the realm of the dead. This is Sheol in the Old Testament, Hades in the New Testament. It's where all the dead go. So it's a way of saying he was really dead. But plenty of people have wanted Jesus to take a trip. So here's from Ducio's Maesta. He took a trip to Limbo. So where is Limbo? Well, Limbo is the place where the Old Testament saints were waiting, and we have our expression to be waiting in limbo, to be in limbo. So here is Jesus. He has burst open the doors of death, crushing Satan, and his feet are trampling on Satan in fulfillment of some Old Testament biblical passages. And he is bringing the Old Testament saints out of their state of limbo into the resurrection. And in front, leading the way, are Adam and Eve. So he's grabbed Adam by the arm. He will be just about to take Eve by the arm. And then behind them, we've got King David with his crown on, the various prophets, and that. The Old Testament saints for whom the death of Jesus is now going to mean their resurrection into life. Jesus is holding a staff from which flies a banner, and that is the cross, and very soon it will be a red cross on a white background for the cross of resurrection. So this scene is also called the harrowing of hell. So harrowing, to bring out of hell the Old Testament saints. Here's Fra Angelico's depiction of it from cell 31 in San Marco. Jesus has, again, he's burst the door of death completely off of its hinges, crushing Satan. He's crushed beneath the door. And we've got various other demons are scurrying away into the nooks and crannies. And we have the Old Testament saints. Jesus is leading out of limbo, out of their sort of bondage to death, leading them out into new life. And the banner of resurrection flying from Jesus' staff. This is a famous depiction. This is from the Kora Museum, what used to be the Kora Church in Istanbul, one of my favorite places. And the Greek text at the top says, He Anastasis, the resurrection. Jesus has risen. We've got the doors underneath his feet, and it's a bit hard to make out, but they have crushed a figure, that is Satan, and scattered around there underneath the doors are broken locks and chains, and because he's broken the chains of death. And he has grabbed by the hand Adam and Eve, and he is pulling them out of their graves. The harrowing of hell, the bringing them into resurrection life. And behind them, Old Testament saints that will follow them. Now, Eastern art, the art of the Eastern Church and the iconography of the Eastern Church pays a lot more attention to the resurrection than it does to the crucifixion. And one of the, as it were, the charges of the Eastern Church against the Western Church is that the Western Church focuses far too much on the crucifixion, far too much on the church, and not enough on the resurrection and on the new life that comes. Okay, so Western art after Giotto and Duccio and Fra Angelico doesn't really show much of the harrowing of hell. It moved on beyond that, and depictions of the resurrection tend to be just an empty tomb, Jesus standing there as the risen Lord. After the resurrection, Jesus made a number of appearances over 40 days, and 3 of them have become important for art. The first is what's called noli me tangere, or noli me tangere. This is John chapter 20. Mary mistakes Jesus for a gardener. Well, Jesus says to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him. I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said in Aramaic, "Rabboni." And Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me." And in Latin, that's noli me tangere. And that scene has been rendered frequently in art. And so that scene is simply called noli me tangere scene. So Duccio depicts that on the Maesta, Mary reaching out to Jesus. He is risen. He's got a blue robe back on with gold. It's got the banner of resurrection there. Giotto painted a noli me tangere scene. The soldiers guarding the tomb are sleeping. Got 2 angels resting on top of the empty tomb, and Mary reaching out to Jesus, and Jesus is holding the banner. Cross would be a red cross, and on that banner it would say usually it would be Alpha and Omega, and Nika, which is victory. It's a bit hard to make out exactly on that one. Fra Angelico did a noli me tangere, cell number 1, and Mary is just come out of, she's just looked in the tomb at the left, and Jesus there urging her not to touch him. This is a particularly famous rendition of this scene, Noli me tangere. It's in the National Gallery in London by Titian, early 16th century. And Mary is almost touching Jesus. He's sort of, as it were, leaning back to avoid her touch. And this is quite skillfully done. We've got a couple of interesting curves to this painting. So there's a curve that follows the line of Mary's back and then up the tree, up to the top of the painting, and then a line that follows Jesus's right leg and his back, and then the buildings in the background and the edge of the hill, and goes off the top right-hand side. And those 2 cross roughly where the horizon is. On the right-hand side, everything is green. We've got a meadow. Sorry, on the left-hand side, everything is green. We've got a meadow with sheep. This is spring, as it were, that's coming with the resurrection of Jesus. The right-hand side is barren and dry and brown. That's the old life. Mary is essentially invited to leave that and enter into the new life that is behind Jesus. Second scene, post-resurrection appearance that gets rendered a lot in art, is the encounter with the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. And they're sorrowful. The stranger comes along, seems that he hasn't heard the news, and then he opens to them the scriptures, but they still don't know who he is. And they stop at an inn to stay the night, and they prevail upon him to stay with them. And they sit down to a meal, and he takes bread, he breaks it and blesses it. And it's in that action that they then recognize him. It's in the breaking and the blessing of sharing of the bread that he recognizes. Rembrandt did a couple of paintings of this, but I think Caravaggio's is much more powerful, masterful presentation of the scene. This is at just the moment when the two disciples have realized who he is. So the man on the left, you can really sense he's pushing his chair back in astonishment, and the man on the right has just reached his arms wide open in astonishment. He's got a cockle shell on his waistcoat or his outer garment there. The cockle shell is an emblem of pilgrimage, and it is specifically associated with the Camino del Santiago that goes all the way across northern Spain from southern France to Santiago de Compostela, where supposedly the bones of St. James are. And a year and a half ago, we were in Bordeaux for 10 days, and there are several paths of the Camino converge in and around Bordeaux and then cross the Pyrenees. And the cockle shell was prominent in and around Bordeaux. Brass plaques in the ground. It was a theme in a number of the facades of churches. So that's just not for decoration, that cockle shell there, or the scallop shell. It's indicating his life of pilgrimage. The servant is none the wiser. He's looking at Jesus a bit quizzically. He doesn't recognize, of course, he wouldn't recognize Jesus. So he's not in on what they have just realized. And Jesus is extending his left arm, his left hand is over the bread, as we're to bless him. His right arm is reaching out an invitation and blessing to these disciples. So masterful painting. And Watanabe, again, to come back to him, he did a depiction of Christ at Emmaus with fish and looks like sushi rolls there on the table, hands in blessing. Many more of these I could have shown. And then the third post-resurrection appearance that gets rendered a lot into art is the doubting Thomas, or the scene is always called the incredulity of St. Thomas. And at the end of John chapter 20, Jesus made two appearances to the disciples in a locked room. The first appearance, Thomas was not there, and the other disciples told him about it. And they said, "We have seen the Lord." And Thomas said, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." 8 days later, Jesus appeared again inside the room. Thomas was with them. And Jesus says, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." So a little gruesome, but here often it's depicted with Thomas really sticking his finger into the wound on the side of Jesus. Now, if you remember back to Da Vinci's Last Supper in Milan, when Thomas is gesticulating on the right side of the image to the right of Jesus, he's pointing with his finger, and that's the finger that will then be placed into the wound in Jesus' side and overcome his incredulity. So that's Caravaggio's rendition. Here is Strozzi, Bernardo Strozzi, similar thing, sticking his finger right into the wound. Now, there are other appearances that Jesus makes to his disciples up in the Galilee. So he appears to them beside the Sea of Galilee, and he appears to them on the mountain at the end of Matthew. So beside the Sea of Galilee, he feeds them breakfast on the beach, and then on the mountain. And in actuality, those two sites are only a couple of 100 yards apart in real geography. They are included in the iconography of the iconographic program, where you have a coherent story. So for example, in Duccio's Maesta, where there's a whole sequence of post-resurrection appearances. But they haven't featured much in Western art, because Western art, in its paying attention to individual scenes, has chosen to focus upon the Noli Me Tangere, the Emmaus Road, and the incredulity of Thomas, and has sort of neglected those other post-resurrection scenes. And then Western art will come back to cover the Ascension, and there's a few scenes of that. But I think that wraps it up. Fairly sure this is my last slide. It is indeed. So any questions? Or have I just overwhelmed you with art? Well, that was a lot of art. I actually, as well, I ran out of time. I would have given you a lot more art, but that is more than enough for you to chew on. And hopefully means when if you go around art museums, or if you see a painting in a book, or in use somehow, you'll be able to read it a little better and have a bit more sense of what is going on in that painting. Most of the images I showed, or at least described in some way, or some of the details are given in the handout. In the case of things like all the images from Giotto or Duccio or Fra Angelico, they're just covered, the basic information given on the opening page under iconographic program. And hopefully on your travels, once we're able to travel again, and you go to places like Italy or so on, and you go and visit San Marco or things, then you might have a bit greater appreciation for what's going on in that depiction. Okay. Okay, at that point, I'm going to stop the recording and then carry on, and I'll stay online for a while and field any questions you might have, or